subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on the accuracy of the census. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. And before I begin, I no doubt believe there'll be some different conclusions and views on this from a partisan perspective, as there always are. But I do think there are some areas here where we can all agree that there are ways to improve the census process. And I do hope we'll be able to have conversations along those lines where there can be some bipartisan agreement that there are things we might be able to do better for future census activities. So look, it is one of the Constitution's simplest commands. Article 1, Section 2 states that an actual enumeration of the American people shall be conducted every 10 years. The decennial census of Americans, though it sounds mundane, is a core pillar of our democracy. It determines how many people represent each state in Congress, how many electoral votes each state gets in our presidential elections, informs the drawing of district lines for state and federal offices, and affects how much money each state receives from the federal government. Simply put, it's important that the Census Bureau gets the count right. And in 2020, it seems that it failed. Indeed, the 2020 census should be called the sanctuary census. Just like sanctuary jurisdictions, the 2020 census unconstitutionally put illegal aliens ahead of American citizens. Under Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, known as the Apportionment Clause, the census must count, quote, the whole number of persons in each state. At the time of the amendment's ratification, the term persons was understood to refer only to members of the American political community, citizens, and permanent resident aliens who had been lawfully admitted to the country. Just as the Supreme Court has held that jurisdiction in the 14th Amendment means, quote, not merely subject in some respect or degree to the jurisdiction of the United States, but completely subject to their political jurisdiction and owing them direct and immediate allegiance, end quote, when determining who is a U.S. citizen who is born to illegal alien parents. Indeed, the Supreme Court has recognized a similar principle, noting in 1992 that constitutional language governing the census contemplates more than mere physical presence and some element of allegiance or enduring tie to a place. It is unthinkable that the 14th Amendment's framers sought to reward states that harbored illegal aliens with additional congressional representation. Yet that is exactly what happens now. After the 2020 census, states with more illegal aliens, often because of a conscious policy choice to hamper federal law enforcement and welcome immigration lawbreakers, get more seats in Congress, more electoral votes, and more of your federal tax dollars. A lot of them, in fact. The leading study found that if congressional seats were properly apportioned based on the number of citizens, Republican states would gain between 10 and 12 seats in the House of Representatives and votes in the Electoral College. That's right. Illegal aliens and non-citizens have at least 10 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and the Electoral College. And that was before Biden administration's policies welcomed 10 million more illegal aliens into our country. During its disastrous 4 years, how many more seats will that give Democrats in the 2030 census if nothing changes? Counting of illegal aliens in the census and as part of the apportionment base also violates the core constitutional principle of one person, one vote. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that state and federal legislative districts must be roughly equal in population so that each citizen's vote is roughly equal in power. The 2020 census undermined this principle by counting illegal aliens in the apportionment base. Today, a voter in a congressional district with 730,000 citizens, residents, and 30,000 illegal aliens has a stronger say in the election of his representative than a voter in a congressional district with 760,000 citizens and no illegal immigrants. Shockingly, though, the problems with the 2020 census did not stop there. Beyond the manifest unconstitutionality of including illegal aliens, the Census Bureau failed at its simplest task, accurately counting the legal population of the United States. The Census Bureau's own after-action report found that it significantly undercounted the population of 6 states, 5 of which, including my home state of Texas, are predominantly Republican. In fact, in addition to Texas losing a seat, Florida lost out on 2 additional seats, Colorado gained a seat that it did not deserve, and Minnesota and Rhode Island each maintained a congressional seat that should have been lost. Conversely, the Census Bureau found that it overcounted in 8 states, 7 of which are predominantly Democratic. Estimates showed that these errors, which were unprecedented in the recent history of the census, cost Republicans 6 seats in the House. 6 seats just from miscounting, and that's on top of the 10 to 12 extra seats Democrats have from counting illegal aliens. What's more, because the Census Bureau used a technique called differential privacy to scramble the data underlying the 2020 census, these errors are impossible to correct without an entirely new census. We have witnesses here today who can explain the technicalities. As our witnesses will highlight, The practice of differential privacy was derided by outside groups across the political and ideological spectrums, calling for the use of it to end. In fact, a 2021 Harvard study on differential privacy's effects on redistricting noted that, quote, it has a tendency to transfer population across geographies in ways that artificially reduce racial and partisan heterogeneity, which makes it impossible to follow the principle of one person, one vote, as it is currently interpreted by courts and policymakers. Together, then, the 2020 sanctuary census denied Republicans 18 seats in the U.S. House, 12 by counting illegal aliens, and another 6 by counting inaccurately. More importantly, it cost law-abiding citizens in states across the U.S. their equal say in Congress and in presidential elections. Congress must act to ensure that, at the very least, that illegal aliens are not counted for the purposes of apportionment. Let's follow the Constitution. Let's stop enabling policies that encourage illegal immigration. Let's stop weaponizing the census for political gain. And let's find bipartisan ways to improve the census, and let's understand the technicalities that we're going to hear about today that we think have bipartisan agreement create problems in terms of the estimating procedures that are used in census. And let's put the American people first. The People's House, the Electoral College, and all the elections and policies that flow from that should be representative of the American people. I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Scanlon, for her opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. I look forward to hearing from you. As our founders recognized, the census is fundamental to our democracy, playing a critical role not just in governance, but in shaping decisions made by organizations and institutions across American life. An accurate census is essential for a fair distribution of political power here in Congress and for the equitable allocation of billions of dollars of federal funds to states and communities, including for programs like Medicaid, free and reduced school lunches, Head Start, SNAP. Its data is used by businesses and nonprofits to determine where and how to operate, and by state and local governments to decide where to invest in public infrastructure like roads and hospitals and schools. But the census is not just some mathematical equation to distribute congressional seats and taxpayer dollars. It's deeply rooted in our founders' vision of what a government by and for the people should be. Alexander Hamilton is on record saying during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, there can be no truer principle than this, that every individual of the community at large has an equal right to the protection of the government. Ultimately, the census is a national snapshot we take every 10 years that helps us understand and define who we are, how to govern, and undermining that process in ways that distort that picture will harm all of us. That's why Democratic and Republican administrations alike have historically tried to protect the census from political interference and partisan pressures. But this president and his MAGA allies are deviating from that precedent, once again trying to rig things in their favor. Now, these efforts aren't new. They began under the first administration when they tried to add an unprecedented citizenship question to the census. This was a blatant attempt by political appointees to exclude non-citizens from our count, which they expected to, quote, benefit Republicans and non-Hispanic whites, end quote, and which was ultimately rejected by the Supreme Court. And those efforts continued with the development of the right-wing Project 2025 manifesto, which, as predicted, has become a playbook for the Trump administration. It devotes a whole section to plans to appoint political appointees loyal to the White House to lead the census in order, quote, to execute a conservative agenda, end quote, which includes trying to add a citizenship question again, focusing census engagement on conservative groups, and limiting efforts to engage historically marginalized and undercounted groups. Then earlier this year, President Trump reinstated a memo to the Commerce Department ordering that the census not count undocumented immigrants when determining each state's share of congressional seats. And we've just heard a little bit of that rationale, which really conflates the idea of who is in this country legally, not legally. We constantly hear from our colleagues here about illegal aliens, not understanding that fully 44% of immigrants in our country are citizens, that another 26% are legal permanent residents, that another 5% are here on visas. So the vast majority of immigrants in our country are in fact here legally, as opposed to the constant refrain we hear from the other side of the aisle. So at any rate, the Constitution's command is that the, quote, whole number of persons be counted. The president has also posted on his social media that he wants his administration to start work on a new census. And in a common theme of this administration, it blatantly ignores the fact that the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the authority to conduct the census. Our Constitution's framers understood the importance of having an accurate and comprehensive population count. That's reflected in the fact that Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, the Enumeration Clause, mandates that representatives be apportioned among the states according to the whole number of persons in each state using an actual enumeration. Later on, the drafters of the 14th Amendment kept this phrasing while amending the clause to account for the end of slavery, reiterating that a state's representation in Congress must be determined by counting the whole number of persons in each state. So it really couldn't be clearer. The census must count the whole number of persons, not just a subset of persons living in the U.S. The Constitution's drafters could have used a narrower term like citizens or voters or something else, which they did, for example, in other parts of the 14th Amendment. But they purposely used the broader term persons in the apportionment provision, making it clear that all people count, including women who could not yet vote at the time of that drafting, children, indentured servants who were often immigrants, and former slaves. And they rejected proposals that would restrict the census to voters. Additionally, the requirement of an actual enumeration has never meant that census takers are only required to count only those who they can reach directly or in person. We know that the effort to count every person every decade has never been perfect, and that's why there have been continual improvements over time. And that's for a variety of reasons, chief among them being that certain populations are difficult for census takers to reach. Renters are harder to reach than homeowners. Children are particularly tough to reach, especially if they are not reading and writing yet. But the Constitution does account for this. The Supreme Court made clear in Utah versus Evans that the Constitution doesn't specify exactly how the census should be counted. As the court noted in that case, census takers implementing our very first count in the late 1700s were only required to report the names of household heads, which is very different from our system now. Our framers knew better than to try and anticipate the technology or methodology that America would need to conduct the count in the future, one that must capture the hundreds of millions of people living in the country today. Instead, the constitutional North Star they gave us for the census is simply that it be accurate. These ongoing efforts to cast doubts about the results of the 2020 census, the census that was conducted, I might add, while Donald Trump was president, are part of a larger scheme. One MAGA extremists have designed to redraw maps mid-decade in a blatant power grab so that Republicans can win more seats in Congress and keep their majority, despite the increasing unpopularity of their Project 2025 agenda. In effect, they're seeking a pre-gerrymander even as they attempt other gerrymanders. The ongoing lawsuit in Florida, which seeks to overturn the 2020 census by challenging some of its counting methodologies, fits right into this scheme. The suit, filed against a Trump administration that's presumably sympathetic to the plaintiffs, may be just the pretext this administration is looking for to push for a census redo. But if their efforts succeed, Americans will suffer. Undercounts and other counting errors particularly hurt vulnerable and hard-to-reach populations, including young children, racial and ethnic minorities, the transient and homeless, those in non-traditional housing arrangements, and those living in very rural or very dense urban communities. In other words, people living in America who patronize its businesses, drive on its roads, attend its schools, and use its essential public services, people who we need to have included in the count. If these lawsuits by plaintiffs get their way and the methods used to account for these populations are prohibited or limited, essentially putting the federal government's head in the sand, will only move farther away from, not closer to, an accurate and complete count. Federal funds will be misdirected. States, local governments, businesses, nonprofits, and others will make less informed decisions, inadvertently depriving people of what they need to live and thrive in our communities. And that is devastating for millions. Of course, we all want, as the chair suggests, our census picture to be fuller and more accurate. It's what our democracy demands, and we should all strive to improve our data collection and prevent undercounts as we look forward to the scheduled regular 2030 census. But to make that a reality, we should be talking about reforms that limit the executive branch's ability to interfere in the count for political purposes, or reforms to ensure that the Census Bureau has adequate funding and flexibility to do the job right. We shouldn't try to curtail or ignore scientific methods which are available to complete such a huge undertaking, or consider changes that make people trust this process less and rather than participating in it more. The census and its results are too consequential for that. So I look forward to hearing our discussion today, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. I appreciate it. The call for a census in Article 1 of the Constitution plays an essential role in our democracy, guaranteeing for centuries that there will be an appropriate allocation of House seats and districts of equal population within each state. President Trump's extraordinary mid-decade partisan gerrymander offensive has hit major roadblocks recently in California, in Utah, and in federal court in Texas. But his forces have continued on their path of destruction and are now targeting the 2020 census itself as a way to tear up the political map of the country. This week, President Trump released this telltale statement on social media. This all began with the rigged census. He said, "We must keep the majority at all costs. Republicans must fight back." So what a syllogism we're offered. Because Trump must keep the majority at all costs, therefore the 2020 census was rigged. This is lunacy. It's like saying, because Trump had to win the 2020 election, he really wanted to win it, therefore the election was rigged and he won it. And that's just derangement. The 2020 census was not rigged. A 2024 report by the Government Accountability Office reviewing the accuracy of the census found that the accuracy of the 2020 national population count was consistent with the previous census, while the Bureau's post-enumeration survey estimated statistically significant net coverage errors in certain regions and states. The accuracy of the count was overall consistent, and overcounts and undercounts at the margins are nothing new. The census was not rigged. The actual institutional weakness of the census, as the GAO reported, is the chronic undercount of communities of color, which persisted through the 2020 census. In 2020, quote, in 2010, Black or African American and Hispanic persons, young children, and renters were systematically undercounted, while non-Hispanic white persons, adults over 50, and homeowners were overcounted. Are we going to have a hearing planned on that? Maybe on the same day we're going to have a hearing with the Epstein victims. I don't know. The Census Bureau faced unprecedented challenges in conducting the 2020 census because of the raging global pandemic and the government's inadequate response to it. COVID-19 significantly complicated census activities, many of which were suspended or delayed. In many states and localities, lockdowns and travel restrictions stopped the Census Bureau from accessing communities entirely. The Bureau also had to contend with natural disasters in a number of states, as well as a planning budget that had been dramatically cut by the first Trump administration. These two are the real problems that we should be discussing today. Instead, we seem to be wasting our time on a long list of fanciful, self-pleading theories that have no basis in law or history and that fly in the plain text of the Constitution. Before we assign blame for any actual or imagined inaccuracies in the results of the 2020 census, let it be clear that it was the first Trump administration that was responsible for preparing the 2020 census. And the greatest obstacle to an accurate 2020 census count was President Trump himself. He repeatedly sought to undermine the accuracy of the count by adding a citizenship question, which experts warned would dramatically depress participation, including by American citizens, and skew the results for Democratic and Republican states alike. Thank goodness that the Roberts Court thwarted that effort when it found that Trump's process was completely contrary to law, and the president's pretext for adding the blatantly political citizenship question was, quote, contrived. The Trump administration told the court that they needed the citizen question to help enforce the Voting Rights Act, and then after oral arguments, evidence came to light indicating that the request of the administration, a GOP redistricting expert, had provided an analysis showing that the addition of a citizenship question to the census and the use of citizen-only data for redistricting would politically benefit Republicans and the white community. The Supreme Court found the administration's formal excuses completely unbelievable, calling them contrived. Now, in his second term, Trump and his allies are once again seeking to weaponize the census in an unlawful way and undermining its accuracy. Trump instructed the Commerce Department to exclude undocumented immigrants from the census count, a policy that one three-judge panel said, quote, has already been rejected by the Constitution, the applicable statutes, in 230 years of our history. The Constitution makes clear that the census includes, quote, the whole number of persons in each state to ensure a complete picture of who resides in the country, as Republican Senator Jacob Howard of Michigan stated during his introduction of the 14th Amendment in 1866, quote, the basis of representation is numbers. That is the whole population, numbers, not voters, numbers, not property. That's the theory of our Constitution. In the face of this overwhelming textual and historical evidence telling us that every person must be counted, some state officials have filed meritless lawsuits against the Commerce Department challenging the constitutionality of the Census Bureau's longstanding constitutionally mandated practice to count all persons who reside within the U.S., regardless of their citizenship status. Right-wing legal activists in Florida have also filed suit against the Commerce Department, claiming that the census's use of group quarters, count imputation, and differential privacy violated the Constitution and the Census Act and call the accuracy of the census into question. Don't let the jargon or these tortured arguments fool you. The lawsuits are part of a coordinated strategy to give cover to this mid-decade attack on the 2020 census's apportionment count ahead of the midterms. Our democracy and our society cannot afford our constitutional census being turned into a constant instrument of partisan conflict, division, and advantage. Let's reject this dangerous direction. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you.
Well, I thank the ranking member. Without recognizing that Mr. Jordan is not here, without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witnesses. I'm going to start with Mr. Mayfield. Mr. Mayfield is a member at Chalmers, Adams, Backer, and Kaufman, where his practice includes complex commercial litigation, constitutional law, and administrative law. Prior to that, Mr. Mayfield was a partner at a boutique litigation firm, an assistant United States attorney, and served as counsel to the director of the United States Census Bureau. Next, Mr. Jay Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez is an assistant attorney general in the office of the Kansas Attorney General. He primarily works on cases involving constitutional issues and was the attorney of record on behalf of the Kansas Attorney General in Louisiana versus Department of Commerce. Mr. Wade Miller. Mr. Miller currently serves as a senior advisor at the Center for Renewing America. Wade is a combat veteran who served in the United States Marine Corps as an infantryman deploying into combat theaters 3 times in Iraq and the Horn of Africa. He has significant experience and involvement in campaign activities, conservative grassroots movement, and the public policy development. And for the record, he also served in my office in my first term in Congress as my chief of staff. And Mr. Yang. Mr. Yang is the president and executive director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice. AAJC works to eliminate discrimination against and to advance the civil rights of Asian Americans. We thank our witnesses for appearing today and will begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Witnesses answered in the affirmative. Let the record reflect that they have. Thank you. Please be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. I'm going to start on the right here with Mr. Mayfield. You have 5 minutes, and you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Roy, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the committee for inviting me here today to discuss issues related to the 2020 census. My name is Trey Mayfield, and I served as counsel to the director of the Census Bureau at the end of the first Trump administration, during which time many legal issues concerning the methodology, accuracy, and use of the 2020 census were raised. Our Constitution is largely concerned with structuring our form of government and placing textual limits on power. The decennial census is one of the very few specific exercises of power mandated by the Constitution. The Census Clause is firmly lodged in Article 1 of the Constitution. It is, for constitutional purposes, a congressional responsibility. In order to apportion members of the House of Representatives among the several states so that House membership proportionally reflects each state's population, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 mandates that there be, quote, an actual enumeration, unquote, every 10 years. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment reiterates that requirement. When interpreting the Constitution, we must look to its text, using the commonly understood meaning of the words at the time it was ratified in 1788. The Constitution requires the actual enumeration. Not surprisingly, dictionaries from the time demonstrate that an enumeration requires an actual counting and not just an estimation of numbers. The founders were well aware of the opportunities for fraud to inflate or deflate a given state's population in order to alter representation in the House. For that reason, the federal government was charged with conducting the census and doing so by actually counting, not estimating, how many people were living in the United States. Since 1790, Congress has consistently reaffirmed in census authorizing legislation that statistical adjustments are prohibited in determining our national population for apportionment purposes. To be sure, census data is used for many purposes other than apportionment, including dispersing federal funds to states and localities, obtaining demographic data, and ascertaining the state of the nation in such ways as the Congress and President deem appropriate. Some kinds of statistical adjustment are permissible in performing those functions, but not for enumeration. Congress has mandated the census, quote, be as accurate as possible, unquote, and banned the use of statistical adjustments for enumeration because it, quote, poses the risk of an inaccurate, invalid, and unconstitutional census. Within those limitations, Congress has delegated responsibility for implementing the census to the Secretary of Commerce and the Census Bureau. Congress also requires the President report to Congress the total population of the nation, each state, and the number of representatives to which each state is entitled. There is no law, however, prohibiting the President from reporting additional information to Congress in that report, such as the number of illegal aliens in the count and what the results of the count would be in their absence. Congress has also prohibited the release of any census data whereby the person who provided the data could be identified. Purportedly to meet this requirement, civil servants at the Bureau apply a methodology to the 2020 census called differential privacy. It violates the Constitution's actual enumeration requirement and the congressional prohibition on the use of such methods. They refused to allow their method to be peer-reviewed or to disclose the data upon which they concluded the differential privacy was needed instead of the method the Bureau had previously used, known as data swapping. Using differential privacy altered both the count and the characteristics of individuals and households reported at the region, district, town, and census block level. In essence, the Bureau's reported population moved people around within states. For instance, when testing differential privacy using the data from the 2010 census, the population of Port Royal, Virginia was artificially increased 87%, while the population of Stony Creek, Virginia was decreased by 43%. In other words, differential privacy results in people from larger subgroups and geographic units being moved to smaller ones. Opposition to differential privacy was unanimous among census stakeholders. Every letter the Bureau received from outside scientists and statisticians came to the same conclusion. Differential privacy is illegal, it is data corrupting, and it addresses a non-existent problem. It was also opposed unanimously by governmental actors and interest groups for reasons as straightforward that using fake population data makes it difficult for governments to carry out core responsibilities, such as drawing district lines and determining where to locate bus stops and schools and how to allocate welfare. Studies since the 2020 census have confirmed that this is exactly what differential privacy does. It adds fake people to where they do not live and subtracts real people from where they do live. Thus, all of the reported enumeration census data from 2020 below the state level is false. I welcome the committee's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayfield. I'll now recognize Mr. Rodriguez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Roy, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the committee. I'm an Assistant Attorney General in the Special Litigation and Constitutional Issues Division of the Kansas Attorney General's Office. And in that role, I'm leading a multi-state federal lawsuit against the Department of Commerce challenging its practice of counting illegal aliens in the census.
Mr. Rodriguez, can you move a little closer to your microphone or ensure that it's on?
Sorry, is that better?
That's better, yes.
When illegal aliens are counted, it inflates the count for a few states with high numbers of illegal aliens and gives those states more political power and representation at the expense of states with smaller numbers of illegal aliens. That violates the Constitution, which requires an actual enumeration of inhabitants to be used for apportioning House seats, and it violates the principle of equal representation by making votes in some states count less than votes in others. The census comes out of Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. It requires Congress to conduct an actual enumeration to be used in the apportionment of representatives and electoral college votes according to the respective numbers in each state. In the founding era, numbers referred to inhabitants, which meant someone with a fixed and permanent connection to the place and some legitimate tie to the political community. Under that definition, illegal aliens are not inhabitants. They're present in the U.S. illegally, subject to removal, and their residence is therefore temporary and contingent. They're not bona fide members of the state, so they should not be included in any enumeration for purposes of apportionment. Historically, Congress has delegated its constitutional authority over the census to the Secretary of Commerce under the Census Act, and the census is conducted according to the rules promulgated by the Secretary. Every census and apportionment, including the most recent one in 2020, has counted illegal aliens at their usual residence, although it's only in the last few decades that the scale of illegal immigration has significantly affected apportionment. In the Supreme Court, there are two broad categories of cases that are relevant to these issues. The first concerns equal representation, or the principle of one person, one vote. Starting in the 1960s, the Supreme Court found that debasement of votes, or vote dilution, is a justiciable injury. And when state voting districts are unequal in population, it means that votes in less populous districts count more than votes in more populous districts, which violates the Equal Protection Clause and the Apportionment Clause. And the court has held that districts must be equal in terms of total population, not in terms of the number of eligible voters. But in these cases, the court set the lower boundary of who should be counted. It hasn't set the upper boundary. Even though total population we know is more than just eligible voters, we don't know that it must include illegal aliens. The second category of relevant cases concerns the conduct of the census. For example, in Department of Commerce versus New York, the court held that asking a question about citizenship was permitted by the Enumeration Clause, given Congress's, quote, unlimited discretion to conduct the census. But including the question violated the Administrative Procedure Act. Without an APA violation, a citizenship question could likely be included in the next census if it was produced by a reasoned decision-making process. And in Trump versus New York in 2020, the court heard a challenge to a Trump administration memo which planned to exclude illegal aliens from the already completed census to the extent feasible. The court dismissed the case for lack of standing since there was no certainty that anyone would actually be removed from the census pursuant to the memo, but it did not rule on the legality of excluding illegal aliens from an actual enumeration. So the census cases show that Congress has broad authority over what information is collected in the census and that counting illegal aliens remains an open question. The court has not said whether the Constitution requires counting illegal aliens or prohibits it, or whether Congress has discretion to decide one way or the other. So the future of the census will be decided in the courts and in Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. I'll now turn to Mr. Miller. You have 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the serious flaws in the 2020 census caused by the Census Bureau's first ever use of differential privacy. Differential privacy is an algorithm that deliberately injects noise, in plain English, false data, into census results below the state level data, all the way down to individual blocks. It alters racial and household composition, changes population counts, and even shifts those fabricated numbers to entirely different neighborhoods, cities, or counties. Census employees will say they are statutorily required to protect privacy as justification for choosing differential privacy to achieve that goal. Under differential privacy, the Bureau insists that state-level totals remain accurate, but everything below that level is intentionally distorted. The amount of distortion is top secret. Only a handful of Bureau officials know the true unaltered numbers. The consequences are severe and criticisms bipartisan. Harvard data scientists found that differential privacy artificially reduces racial and partisan diversity, making it impossible to achieve genuine one-person, one-vote equality. The Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund and Asian Americans Advancing Justice concluded that the data altered by this method are too inaccurate to satisfy the Voting Rights Act or the equal population requirements for redistricting. Rural and low population areas suffered the greatest proportional harm, distorting the partisan makeup of Congress and potentially affecting billions in federal funding. Differential privacy also has 3 fatal structural flaws. 1, it renders the count question resolution process meaningless. Localities can no longer tell whether a number is wrong because of an actual counting error or because the Bureau intentionally falsified it. 2, it injects distorted data into every state's redistricting process, casting doubt on the legitimacy of district lines. 3, it effectively gives bureaucrats a permanent tool to obscure non-citizen and illegal immigrant populations, nullifying any future citizenship question and shifting political power away from American citizens. Some limited analysis suggests an estimated 2% movement of numerical population data, but some reporting has suggested that upwards of 20% movement is allowable. Either way, this poses serious constitutional concerns. Compounding these problems, the 2020 census was the most inaccurate in modern history. The Bureau's own post-enumeration survey admitted statistically significant undercounts in 6 states, mostly red states: Arkansas, Florida, Illinois, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas, and overcounts in 8 states, mostly blue states: Delaware, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, Rhode Island, and Utah. Those errors alone shifted at least 6 congressional seats and electoral votes to the wrong states. Those errors all benefited Democrats. When you combine known political imbalances in the raw count with an opaque algorithm that deliberately moves and alters population data, and all of those problems coincidentally mathematically tend to benefit the left, it is reasonable for Americans to conclude that the 2020 census was weaponized, if not intentionally, through malpractice. Public trust in the Census Bureau has been badly damaged as a result. Restoring that trust is simple. Congress and the current and next administration must correct the errors committed by the census bureaucracy leading up to the 2020 census and permanently prohibit the use of differential privacy. Differential privacy policy, for the purposes of satisfying statutory privacy requirements, is insufficient as a justification. Statutory privacy requirements cannot serve as grounds for ignoring the constitutional requirements that flow from census data. The 2030 census returns need to be accurate, transparent, and politically neutral, the way the Constitution demands. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. I'll now turn to Mr. Yang, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Roy, Ranking Member Scanlon, Committee Chair Jordan, and Ranking Member Raskin. Thank you for inviting me to testify here today. My name is John C. Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. AAJC is part of a national network that includes independent affiliates in Atlanta, Chicago, and Los Angeles, as well as 37 community partners in 37 different states, as well as the District of Columbia. We have served on numerous advisory committees for the Census Bureau, including the most recent 2030 Census Advisory Committee. We maintain a permanent census program that monitors census policy, educates policymakers, and conducts community outreach and education. I appreciate this opportunity to testify before all of you on the importance of the accuracy of the census. An inaccurate census hurts everyone in this country. Over $2.2 trillion in federal funding is allocated based on census data. State and local governments decide where to build hospitals, where to build schools, how to widen highways based on the census data. Businesses decide where to put new stores, what inventory to include in those new stores, based on demographic data provided by the census. That's why every administration going back to 1790, whether Republican, Democrat, Whig, Federalist, Democratic, Republican, has supported policies and supported a budget to fund an accurate census. Traditionally, ensuring accurate census has been a bipartisan endeavor, and it has been about science and it has been about statistics. Under the Constitution, the census requires the counting of the whole number of persons. The Supreme Court, as well as the text and history of the 14th Amendment, makes clear that apportionment is based on total population and not subsets. Arguments about counts based solely on immigration status or eligible voters have been repeatedly rejected by Congress and the courts. Any attempt to add a question concerning citizenship or immigration status will only make the census inaccurate. Studies have repeatedly shown that questions such as the citizenship question only cause people to decline to participate in the census. To be clear, those persons are not limited to non-citizens, but also include households that include both citizens and non-citizens. Such inaccuracies will mean that resources will not be distributed appropriately throughout the country. It also contradicts the Constitution's edict to equal representation for all. The Census Bureau is committed to producing and disseminating objective, credible, and useful statistics to support the decision-making of governments, businesses, philanthropy, and social service organizations. Although the total population count of the 2020 census did not see a significant overcount or undercount, we did see that specific populations did have undercounts. The 2020 census showed an undercount for children under 4 of over 5%. Of rural areas were undercounted by around 4%. The Hispanic community was undercounted by over 5%, the African American community by around 3%, and the American Indian tribal population by over 5%. Now, two common reasons exist for undercounts. First is anti-government sentiment, and privacy concerns are causing people to resist sharing information with the government. Less than a third of the US population have trust in the federal government. Accordingly, the Census Bureau takes its responsibility to maintain the confidentiality of the information very, very seriously by ensuring that personally identifiable information is not shared or distributed to any other government or any other agency at any level. Now, differential privacy is simply one means for accomplishing that confidentiality. Basically, it creates statistical noise to mask personally identifiable characteristics that could be revealed when census data is overlaid against other publicly available data. Now, to be clear, and everyone has agreed, differential privacy is not used at the state level and therefore has no effect on apportionment. Now, the second common reason for undercounts is the lack of a robust get-out-the-count program, especially for communities that are traditionally undercounted or difficult to count. States that invest in their census outreach and invest in their operations are more likely to have accurate counts when compared to states that did not invest in their populations. A state's lack of investment in their census therefore not only results in a potential loss of representation in Congress, but also in a loss of resources. For example, many experts expected that Alabama would lose a congressional seat in the 2020 census. The state, however, invested in get-out-count operations at an early stage, and Governor Ivey was very vocal in pushing Alabamans to participate. As a result, the state did not lose a seat. In conclusion, it is clear that calling all persons, not just citizens or legal residents, is a constitutional requirement that is also critical for determining the allocation of federal funds and for making data-based business decisions. Rather than seeking to exclude certain classes of people from the count, policymakers and the Census Bureau must do everything they can to ensure that everyone is counted. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to questions.
Thank you for your opening statement, Mr. Yang. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing on this very important matter. And thank you all on the panel for your presence today and for your expertise that you bring to the table. I want to take just a moment to talk about the importance of including a citizenship question in our census. And I want to come to you, Mr. Miller. Should the census include a citizenship question?
Yes, I would argue that it is constitutionally mandated in terms of what the census is seeking to produce from a constitutional perspective. So knowing citizenship or residency status, lawful permanent residence status, or otherwise is important in understanding how all of the total population fits into what you must do with that data.
Thank you. And has the census ever included a citizenship question?
That's a good question historically. Did anyone, I think it has historically, but has not recently. They tried to get that going last time and ran into APA violation issues, and so it was not included.
And I kind of follow up to that because I think it has, and why was the question removed? That would be the real question here.
Are you asking me to speculate? So I suspect that it was an attempt to try to increase population levels in ways that would help certain states because they're now counting illegal immigrants for the purposes of apportionment and illegal immigrants and legal immigrants for the purposes of redistricting.
Okay, and what are some of the effects of leaving a citizenship question out of the census?
If you don't know accurate citizen status, then if your argument is that it is that constitutionally you should only be creating political districts with those who are here lawful permanent residents and citizens or just citizens, then you need to know that data in order to create political maps that reflect that data set, if that's your objective.
Sure. So the result of our census not only controls how congressional and state districts are drawn, but it also directs the flow of federal dollars. I mean, we talk about Medicaid, highway funds, education, SNAP benefits, all use population and demographic data from the census to award funds. And so when we don't distinguish between citizens and non-citizens when determining our population, it incentivizes states to mass import illegals through sanctuary policies. Now, we just went through the Big Beautiful Bill or Working Families Tax Act, and we made an effort to ensure illegals are not accessing welfare programs, but I'm worried that when we allow them to be considered for purposes of determining benefit formulas, it undermines that purpose. So, Mr. Miller, do you agree that including illegal aliens in population totals for federal programs undermines the recent reforms to prohibit illegal aliens from taking benefits away from Americans?
Certainly, so there's two questions here. Should you count them? And then how should that data be used and for what purposes? But certainly if you are counting illegal aliens and you don't know their location and the location of those illegal aliens because of differential privacy is being moved around, that would have significant impacts on every single federal funding formula, assuming that memorandums of understanding are not being properly submitted to the census to ascertain accurate information on ways to disperse those federal funds.
Agreed. And I would submit that when we allow illegal aliens to be counted toward the total population for the purposes of determining welfare award numbers, it distorts the proper amount that should be given to that community, and that ultimately puts a further strain on the federal budget. Mr. Mayfield, let me ask you real quickly in the last moment I have. I'm very grateful to be serving in the House of Representatives, which is a Democratic body, but I worry that the errors in the 2020 census undermine this institution and its purposes, which is to represent the American people. Can you, Mr. Mayfield, explain how the way in which the 2020 census was conducted undermined the representation of the American people?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. It's important in asking that question to make a distinction between two things: the gathering of the data, the collection, and the processing of that data. The gathering of the data by the census in 2020 was exemplary. As your colleague, Mr. Raskin, pointed out, the COVID pandemic made things extremely difficult. There were also hurricanes that affected, in particular, Alabama and Louisiana, and so the collection was delayed. The collection was tied for the most successful census in history. We had a 99.98 household contact rate. I say we, I had nothing to do with that. The Bureau did. There were three primary reasons for that success. Number one, President Trump insisted that the census follow regular order and not make shortcuts in the census. Number two, the census had done a good job over the previous decade implementing technology and cutting out many, many layers of needless follow-up, including using administrative records such as the Postal Service. And three, as you may recall, the census lockdown day was March 18th. As chance would happen it, Census Day is April 1st, so virtually everyone was in their home. Once they got done watching Tiger King, they decided to fill out their census forms. The problem that the people here have spoken to here today comes in this census is data processing. The largest problem was differential privacy, which, as several speakers have alluded, moves people around. In the modeling prior to the census that was done at the University of Virginia, under a census contract, it basically, I'm summing this up, moved people from urban areas to rural areas where they did not exist. You can all discern from that if that's true what the political modeling would look like. Another major problem in
Mr. Mayfield, if you can wrap this up.
Sure.
We're a little over time.
Group quarters was a problem because colleges in particular and other large quarters were double counted. The census went back and changed the data to assume that people were where they thought they were instead of just where they were when they answered the census.
Thank you. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayfield. Thank you, gentleman from North Carolina. I'm now going to recognize the gentleman from Maryland, the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Raskin.
And thank you kindly, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Yang, first of all, Section 1 of the 14th Amendment states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And then in Section 2, it says that representatives shall be apportioned among the states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. So obviously the framers of the 14th Amendment understood the difference between citizens and persons, and they used citizens when they meant citizens. They used persons when they meant persons. Doesn't that pretty much settle this bizarrely lingering question of whether or not we should be counting all persons or just citizens when we perform the census?
That's absolutely correct. Thank you for that question. If you look at the text of the Constitution and the 14th Amendment, it counts all persons in the state. And frankly, some of the history, both of the 14th Amendment and going back to the founding of the Constitution, illustrate that they wanted to count the entire population and not simply voters, not simply landowners. And obviously at that point, women could not vote. Obviously, children could not vote. So they want to include the entire population. Frankly, this debate also came up in 1929 during what was called the Apportionment Act. That was the only time in Congress after the 1920 census where we did not have apportionment. And in that debate, part of the debate was whether certain people should be counted. And during that debate, the end of the debate, everyone decided that it is still based on all population. But during that debate, some argued that people should not be counted. Specifically, one representative argued that it should count only voters or citizens because otherwise it would include the thousands of unnaturalized aliens. Another representative said that they didn't want to count thousands of Mexicans and Oriental aliens, and that those people would end up somehow giving extra seats to California in that particular case. When they talk about Oriental aliens, I will take that personally because at that time, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act, which meant that Chinese were not citizens. Nevertheless, during that time, it was settled that it should still be all population for purposes of the census.
Right, and of course, at various points in American history, the determination to count just voters would have excluded women, Native Americans, today children still, right? So will you explain this controversy around differential privacy, which seems to be a new one? Will you explain what that means, what the practice is, and then what your response is to your fellow panelists there? And specifically, if you would address Mr. Mayfield's last point, that I think this is inflating the population of rural communities by falsely attributing people from urban communities to rural communities, which would seem to me to be inflating the numbers in red districts. But
no, thank you for that question. Again, the starting point is that differential privacy was not used at the state level. So,
what it is first.
Sure. So differential privacy is basically the notion that you will inject, some call it statistical noise, but masking data in the census data. Typically, you would take a certain piece of data and transfer it to another individual so that you can't identify individual A. Because concern with big tech now, with big data, individual A, if you have enough information both from the census and what is available on the web, you might be able to identify that person, oh, that must be so-and-so who lives on this block. So the concern was we needed to devise a system that would take some of the data, switch it around so that you can't identify that individual. But again, it was not used at the state level. So any argument that somehow a state got less seats or state got more seats because of it is just not.
So where was it used?
So it was used certainly at the lower levels.
I mean, what do you mean?
Most-
You mean at the
so-
county or municipal levels?
Right, so at what's called the census block level, census tract level, it was used there. And I agree that there could be concerns about how you use that, but at the end of the day, everyone that's been doing redistricting still uses that data that's available, what's called PL
Well,
94.
when the Trump administration administered that or implemented that in the 2020 census, was that the first time it was ever used?
Yes, that was the first time that it was ever used.
Okay. And so, Mr. Mayfield, was your point that we shouldn't be using that anymore, even if it doesn't affect congressional reapportionment, it affects local apportionment in like city council races, county council, things like that?
To clarify, Congressman, it affects all redistricting within a state. So my friend's point is that if Indiana has a population, say, of 3 million, that's probably correct within the normal parameters of accuracy. But how Indiana's 9 congressmen, I apologize if I got that wrong, are allocated is going to be incorrect and down to the legislative and district and town levels. That error will permeate within each state below the state level. When he refers to apportionment, he means the number of representatives that are allocated to each state after the census.
With your indulgence, Mr. Chair, if I could just ask him to finish this point. Well, so why was this differential privacy thing adopted? What problem was it addressing, and what would the alternative be to the problem of not being able to get in particular people's houses if they don't open the door or whatever?
Sure. Well, differential privacy has nothing to do with collection. It has to do with ensuring that Section 9 of Title 13 is adhered to. And in that, Congress has prohibited the release of personal information based on using the data. So in other words, we don't release the raw data, the short form that everyone fills out. That data is very basic. There are basically 9 questions: name, phone number, address, racial characteristic, your relationship to the household head, your gender. The only real personal information on that is name, address, phone number. And so Census has always kept the granular data out of the public eye. So you can't get census data that's actually collected. In the past 3 censuses, 2010, 2020, 2010, 2000, and 1990, the Bureau used what's called data swapping. And so imagine you have a block, there are 5 houses on each side of the block. Because the smallest unit of data that is public release is at the block level, the Bureau scrambles that data. So you don't know if there's a 20-year-old living on this side and a young daughter living on this side. But that was always used. There was never a problem with it, and no one outside of the people driving differential privacy thought there was a problem, and they advocated for continuing to use that method.
I think the ranking member first question, and I'm going to use a little prerogative because there's some technical stuff here, particularly when it's a nonpartisan point, so I don't mind it going over on either side, because this differential privacy is highly complex. And I do think this committee, on a nonpartisan basis, we need to understand it and understand it fully, so I'll try to allow some of that explanation as necessary, kind of on both sides where it's appropriate. With that, I would be recognizing the gentleman from California, my friend, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you. Mr. Rodriguez, if the 14th Amendment actually confers automatic citizenship to anyone who's born here, as the Democrats contend, seems to me it would have said all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States, period. That's pretty clear. But as you know, that's not what it says. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Well, what does that mean?
Well, the courts have interpreted subject to the jurisdiction thereof in other contexts for purposes of due process or equal protection, and it's certainly been broader than naturalized or legal residents. So it's
But
still...
has the Supreme Court ever rendered a decision on whether it applies to those who are illegally in this country, who have never sworn allegiance to it, and have defied its laws to be here in the first place, and under its laws are subject to deportation as soon as encountered? I realize the ARC decision was rendered 127 years ago, but that applied to legal immigrants who accepted the jurisdiction of the United States by obeying our immigration laws and who'd taken up legal permanent residence subject to a treaty ratified by the Senate.
Right, there seems to be no directly on-point Supreme Court decision that says that the children of illegal immigrants are or are not citizens.
So perhaps we're due to have that at some point decided by the Supreme Court or decided by the people through constitutional amendment or statute, am I correct?
It does seem like it will be heard in the near future.
Mr. Mayfield, it seems to me that a census is neither science nor statistics. A census is counting real people. People have names, dates of birth, addresses, and other identifying information. How can it possibly be that we include in our census any count without names and such identifying characteristics? Seems to me if you don't have a person, they shouldn't be counted in a census of people. How did we deviate from this simple principle?
If I understand your question, Congressman, the first aspect of the census is voluntary compliance with it. Every American is required to answer it by law, but the deal that Congress has made is that that information will not be disclosed. In fact, it cannot even be subpoenaed by a court. That's just how tight the information is kept. So approximately 67% of Americans voluntarily filled out the short form, which is what is your household data as of April 1st, 2020. So for the remaining third of the country, the census endeavors to learn that information, and so it does so.
You knock on the door, you get a count of the people who actually live there, you enter them on the census register. That's been done since time immemorial, but I'm reading now of statistical errors that shifted the apportionment of congressional seats away from Republican states toward Democratic states. Now, how can that be if we're actually counting real people?
It's important to remember, Congressman, that several members have alluded to so-called errors after the fact. The census does what's called the post-enumeration survey. That is modeling. That is a statistical guess.
Well, how did we reach a point where we're guessing in the census? Either you're a real person or you're not. If you're not, you don't belong in the census. If you are, we count you.
Well, as Justice Scalia pointed out in Department of Commerce versus the House of Representatives, it's imperfect science, enumeration, but it's better than anything else we've got.
It's not science. It's a simple matter of counting real people.
Well, Congressman, there are many people who are very hard to reach. For instance, homeless people, which the census works very hard to count. There are people
So
who are
you
mobile.
work very hard to find them, but if you can't find them, you don't make them up. That's not a real census. That's guesswork. Mr. Miller, any thoughts?
Yeah, it is extremely important that the data that is collected, at least the sensitive top secret version of this data, be highly accurate, and that we don't just invent people, because like former processes have just swapped people. The new process literally deconstructs a person and every characteristic, and then just in the aggregate creates them elsewhere in a whole bunch of different profiles all over the map. It's a complete mess. There's all sorts of constitutional problems with the way we've done it that have impacted redistricting. And there are some arguments that if you don't want to count illegal aliens for the purposes of apportionment, because your argument is that they are not under the political jurisdiction of the United States of America at the time of birth, that would impact apportionment, because if you're using differential privacy, you may not know, we don't know what they're doing with that characteristic data. Is it actually adding up all the way to the top accurately or not? And the biggest problem with all of this is we assume it is. It may not be impacting apportionment, but it's all top secret. We don't have eyes on it. We can't verify it. No one can go right now and say that 100% yes, all of this data, even the characteristic data, let alone the population data, is accurate. And that's a huge problem.
Thank the gentleman from California. I will now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I think we all agree on the importance of accuracy in our census results. I am concerned about some of the actions that are being advocated for as actually undermining some of that accuracy. And I want to turn to the citizenship question first and put aside the Constitution, which is a strange thing to say in the Constitution Subcommittee, but to not necessarily look at what the Constitution says, specifically persons rather than just citizens, and actually talk about how adding a citizenship question would make the census less accurate. And so I'm going to come to you, Mr. Yang, because there is a lot of data that shows that communities of color, including American citizens, have been historically undercounted. And this undercounting question is directly related to what might happen if a citizenship question was added to the census. And so can you speak to how adding a citizenship question actually hurts us in terms of accuracy and increasing undercounting?
Thank you for that question, Representative. The bottom line is we want an accurate census. All the studies that we have seen, including by the Census Bureau, show that the addition of a citizenship question will undermine the accuracy of the census, not only for immigrants, but for all Americans, because there's a hesitancy about how that data is going to be used. So and that was documented, especially in even going up to the 2020 census, even after the Supreme Court decision that said that we cannot have the citizenship question, there are still people that were concerned about whether that question appeared. That is part of the reason why many believe that Hispanic Americans were undercounted by over 5%. The other thing that we should remember about this is actually, so there is a citizenship question on what's called the long form, the American Community Survey of the census. Now that is a form that contains 50 questions. It has been tested in terms of how we can do that in a way that captures the data accurately. So again, the bottom line is accuracy.
So let me go to the question of undercounting. If there is undercounting, substantial undercounting, how does that undercount harm American citizens in terms of how the census is utilized?
Well, the undercount affects American citizens then because we will have areas where there's more population than was expected, even though the roads are not wide enough, even though the schools are not big enough, even though the public services are not big enough. And let's be clear, right? Highways, public services aren't dependent on immigrant status. It's dependent on the actual residents that live in that community.
And so give me some of the other reasons for anyone that's listening to this debate and trying to understand it for why non-citizens should be counted. And again, you know, we're clear about what the Constitution says, but
Right.
Go ahead.
Again, why non-citizens should be counted is because they are part of the entire community that we're talking about. When we break it down in terms of non-citizens, obviously that would include people that are legal permanent residents. That would include people that are refugees. It includes a large body of community that participate in that community, that deserve to have a voice in that community, and nevertheless have not yet attained this notion of citizenship. And historically, that's been part of the debates that we've had, whether it was for the 14th Amendment, the original founding of the Constitution, or as I pointed out in the 1929 Apportionment Act. And we've always agreed with the general principle that we should represent the entire population, and not just a small subset of that population.
Yeah, and I think that's very real that we have many, many mixed status families in this country. And so, you know, if you insert fear into one group of people, it certainly affects the entire family's trust in government.
I appreciate that you bring up the notion of mixed status families. What that means is you have a family that has some citizens, some non-citizens, maybe even someone that is undocumented. In that situation, that citizen in that household would not get the services that they would be entitled to because of the fact that they are not being counted correctly.
I wanted to go back to differential privacy because as the chairman knows, this is an issue where we all have a lot of concerns about surveillance. And I guess I want to understand why we would want to eliminate that ability to really mask, you know, the characteristics so that we can get accurate assessments. So I wonder if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, and I think the bottom line here is how do we guarantee confidentiality for the community so that the community can trust that when they are responding to the census, their identity will not be made public. And the reason this differential privacy policy was developed was because of the advent of big data. Mm-hmm. Now you are able to get so much more information about individuals off of the internet, so that what might have been unidentifiable before by simply swapping data at that block level is not going to be enough. So that is why this is developed. I agree that we all have concerns. We've asked questions about how this is implemented, and perhaps some fine-tuning is appropriate. But that is a proper source of inquiry. But the notion of disregarding it altogether, I think would.
And what would be the fine-tuning?
I think this is where we all need to continue to work with the Census Bureau to see what worked, what didn't. The Census Bureau, when they said that they were announcing this differential privacy policy, among other things, they said that for 95% of the jurisdictions, they expected error rate of under 5%. So in that context, then you start to understand, okay, this data at these levels still should be accurate. Now, I would agree, we need to test that and to see where those 5% did not work, what that actually looks like. I think that's an appropriate area for inquiry.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady for her questions. I will now represent Mr. Onder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't agree more with President Trump that we need to restore the integrity of our census, and that begins with refusing to count illegal aliens in our census. For too long, sanctuary states have openly defied federal laws and been rewarded with more political power, more congressional seats, and more influence. This is unacceptable, and it's undermining the very foundation of equal representation. Meanwhile, states like Missouri, that I represent, that follow and respect the law, have a diluted voice in Washington. And not because we have done anything wrong, but because other states have chosen to disregard federal immigration law, and they benefit politically by doing so. Mr. Rodriguez, doesn't this mean that sanctuary policies, if we count illegal aliens in the census, have the effect of giving Democrats an unfair advantage in Congress, in the Electoral College, and in federal funding?
To some extent, I don't think it's entirely partisan, though. There are red states like Texas, which also have disproportionate levels of illegal aliens in their state, and they also benefit. But
Right.
for sure, California has been the state that has benefited most from this policy.
Yeah, but Texas does not have a sanctuary state
yes,
policy, of course. So if illegal immigrants are excluded from apportionment accounts, wouldn't we see some shift in political power back to states that follow the law?
Yes.
Yeah. And because census results also determine how literally trillions of dollars of federal dollars are distributed, are my constituents in Missouri subsidizing sanctuary states with large illegal alien populations?
They likely are. And it's important to note that under federal law, the Personal Responsibility and Work Organization Reconciliation Act of 1996 prohibits illegal aliens from receiving federal benefits. So calculations for federal benefit purposes that are based on illegal alien populations are wrong under the law.
Right. And so again, we know that looking back on the 2020 census, it is clear the Census Bureau has admitted that there were errors in states, in the counting of states, and 5 of the 6 states that were undercounted were red states, and 7 of the 8 states that were overcounted were blue or swing states. Mr. Miller, can you explain how these inaccuracies in the 2020 census occurred, and what can be done differently in the 2030 census?
So the Census, excuse me, the Census Bureau would argue that these were difficulties that they encountered due to COVID, and that was kind of a historical, unprecedented event that occurred during a census, at least in modern times that I'm aware of. I think that's...
excuse me if I interrupt. It seems like everything is blamed on COVID.
Right.
Supply chains are blamed on COVID, lack of educational attainment, COVID, workforce, COVID. What specifically, how did fighting this virus lead to these inaccuracies?
Well, that's why it just doesn't make much sense to me, because the states that were undercounted were generally more open.
Were people wearing gloves and masks and not able to count properly? I don't know.
Yeah, and the states that were overcounted were the ones that were locked down and closed more so than... So I just don't understand the whole COVID logic. I'll take them at their word, but it's certainly a strange outcome.
Yeah, maybe everyone at the Census Bureau working from home and not actually out counting persons. Do we really know the full extent, Mr. Miller, of the 2020 census's inaccuracies? I mean, if they admit to this,
No, they have admitted to major miscounts. We do not know the extent to which differential privacy has had an impact, because the Tiger file that all of this exists at the Census Bureau is top secret. Only a few people have access to it. And this is an oversight problem that We really need to get some data statisticians in there to really analyze, with clearance, to analyze the impacts. Because whether it's urban to rural or rural to urban, there has been a lot of population movement, and I've seen studies arguing both sides of this. But there are big problems with this on a variety of fronts.
And again, remind us of what's the alternative to the differential privacy scheme?
Well, there can be a lot of these. IPMS has a really good analysis on how to address this. Past practices have used swapping, the limited swapping.
Right.
I think one solution is just turn off characteristic data until you get to a statistically significant level
where you
numerical data available, but turn off all the characteristic data until you're up at like the census tracker county level. And that way, it's really hard to reverse engineer the algorithm with population numbers that strong.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you so much. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I will now represent the gentlelady from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I appreciate your time. This is a hearing about the census, so essentially a hearing about counting people, or put another way, determining who counts and who doesn't. And President Trump has made clear that he feels that birthright citizenship is not constitutional. He feels that non-citizens should not be counted in the census. He has made clear that he views the 2020 census as illegitimate. But the truth is, the president can feel any way he wants. The courts have spoken. Birthright citizenship is the law of the land. The census counts for everyone, and the 2020 census was as accurate as the 2010 census. And yet here we are again in a hearing to make these claims, these nonsensical legal theories, more legitimate by holding hearings about them. And more broadly, I think this hearing props up baseless legal theories that undermine the census and threaten our representative democracy. And I want to associate myself with the remarks of my Democratic colleagues. But I'd like to take my time to go in a little bit different direction here. I want to spend my time getting to the heart of this question of who counts and who doesn't count in the eyes of this administration, who is seen as a real American and who is not. An investigative report by ProPublica has found that more than 170 American citizens have been detained by immigration agents. They've been dragged, they've been kicked, they have been detained for days at a time. These are US citizens, they are our fellow Americans, and yet top Trump administration officials keep denying that US citizens have been arrested or detained at all in the immigration raids that are taking place across this country. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has repeatedly falsely claimed that no American citizens have been arrested or detained. So there are two reasons that we have that she could be doing this. One is that she is blatantly lying to the press. That is one option. Another is that she doesn't know what is happening under her own leadership. Either option is deeply disturbing to me. We have so much evidence that what Noem has been saying about this is untrue. Many news outlets have confirmed these arrests and have spoken directly to US citizens who have been arrested or detained by immigration agents. They have gathered these disturbing stories about how our own citizens are being treated by this administration. We have the evidence. There's the case of American citizen George Retes, an Army veteran who was pulled out of his car by federal agents who were raiding a farm north of Los Angeles. In his words, "They sat me down on the dirt with my hands zip-tied behind my back. I told them I was a citizen. I told them I had ID. They didn't care. They never asked me for it." This US citizen was held for 3 days before finally being released. He was never charged with a crime. And he's just one of many US citizens that we can document who have been detained or arrested. Again, we have the proof, and yet Secretary Noem continues to spread false information. Then there's the case of Jason Brian Gavidia. Jason is a US citizen who worked at a tow truck yard when Border Patrol agents stormed in. Jason was handcuffed as he pleaded with the agents. He said, "Let me show you my ID, let me prove my status." He said they didn't care. All they cared about was the fact that I was brown and that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's not right. We're in America. That's not right. The point is that the only people who seem to count as Americans to this administration are the people who look American. And any of us sitting here in this room, regardless of party, would be shocked would be outraged, would express righteous indignation if we were detained based on our physical appearance or on our profile alone. Regardless of what we believe about this president, I would hope that we would agree, we would howl at our due process rights being denied.
Would the gentleman yield for a quick
I
question?
will.
Well,
I
what
will.
does it mean to look like an American in 2025?
Yes, thank you very much. It seems clear to me that looking like American is somebody who does not have brown or black skin, and sounding like American is someone who does not have an accent. That seems like that's been established. And I just want to end with this. There is nothing more important than a person's liberty. Nothing. And I would hope that we could all agree on that. And we should all be standing up to our government when it is arresting and detaining citizens illegally and then lying about it. Citizenship in this country is not based on the color of your skin. It is not based on the accent that you have. And based on the actions of this administration, I'm not confident that it believes this, and I find this deeply chilling. Before I yield back, I have several unanimous consents that I would like to enter into the record. First being ProPublica, immigration agents have held more than 170 Americans against their will. NPR fact-checks Kristi Noem on ICE detaining U.S. citizens. And an article in the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, citizenship question effects on household survey responses, and also an October 2015 report by the Congressional Research Service entitled Apportioning Seats in the U.S. House of Representatives Using the 2013 Estimated Population, concluding that excluding non-citizens for apportionment purposes likely requires a constitutional amendment. I yield back.
Without objection, those four will be entered into the record. I will now recognize the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mayfeld, we've asked it before, haven't we? We've asked the citizenship question on the census before, haven't we?
That's correct, Congressman.
From 1820 to 1950, we asked that question. That's 130 years. From 1970 to 2000, another 30 years. So 150 years, we asked the question.
That's correct.
And the previous speaker just said, if we ask the citizenship question, it's going to threaten democracy. Well, it didn't hurt democracy for 150 years. In fact, I would bet if you, I'll use our district. You go to Urbana, Ohio, our hometown. I bet if I went to Urbana, Ohio, I walk to the post office or walk anywhere, any store, walk in, I see someone I know, Mr. Smith. Do you think on the census, you know what the census is, of course? Oh, sure, every so often we find out how many, we count the number of people in the country. I said, Mr. Smith, do you think when we're counting the number of people in this country, it's appropriate to find out how many are citizens? What do you think he would say? What do you think the average person would say?
I suspect the answer would be yes, sir.
It would not only be yes, they'd say, well, aren't you already doing that? That's pretty stupid if you're not. That's where the American people are. Everyone's for counting it. We did it for 150 years of our 250 years as a country, or since we declared independence, 249, almost 250 years now. We've done it for most of our history. Everyone thinks we're doing it. Everyone thinks we should do it, except Democrats in Congress. It was interesting, too, in Mr. Yang's testimony, he said, oh, if we ask the question, we'll get inaccurate counts. And then he went on for the rest of his 5 minutes and talked about all the inaccuracies in the recent censuses where we're not asking it. Undercounts, overcounts, rural America, Hispanic Americans, pointing out all the problems, and we're not asking the question. But somehow if we ask it, oh, it might get worse because we have some study. He even said, like, people thought it might be on the census questionnaire and it wasn't, and that hurt the count, which makes no sense to me. It wasn't a question. So I think this is so darn simple. Count the persons. That's what the Constitution says. Count the number of people, and while you're doing that, find out how many are citizens. What's wrong with that? It might actually help policymakers when we're determining policy if we know those two numbers. That's all we need to focus on. And I'll go to Mr. Miller if he's got any comments about what I commented on.
On the last part, I absolutely agree. And so there is some question on who to count. I think that this, if you get into it technically, the answer is you can count everyone. You just need to know certain population numerical data and then residency status, because that could bleed into policy questions later. And I think that that's an important distinction to know, that you can use different data sets within the totality of that data for different purposes.
Of course, and that's useful information for policymakers. That's why we do it that way. I mean, I get that. Let me ask you this question, Mr. Miller. Do you think asking a citizenship question on the census is any way a threat to democracy?
I do not. I think it's constitutionally mandated. If you
Mr.
really
Rodriguez, do you think, a constitutional scholar here, do you think that's somehow a threat to democracy if we ask how many people are here and how many citizens are here?
No, it's entirely consistent with Congress's.
Mr. Mayfield, do you think that's a threat to democracy?
The census has no effect on democracy, Congressman.
Exactly. Mr. Yang, do you think asking a citizenship question, while you say it might impact the accuracy, I don't know that I agree with that, I frankly disagree. Do you think that might threaten democracy in some manner?
It's a threat to accuracy, which means that it would be a threat to how we allocate funds in the United States.
That's not what I asked you. I said, do you think it's a threat to democracy? Because that's what my Democrat colleague said just 4 minutes ago.
How people are being represented and the funding that they get would be a threat, yes.
You think asking a citizenship, so the Democrat witness thinks asking a citizenship question on the census is a threat to democracy. You think that's true?
As currently constituted, it could be, yes.
Well, that's amazing. That's amazing. Finding out the number of people and the number of citizens in our country is somehow a threat to democracy. That's what the Democrat witness said in a House Judiciary Subcommittee hearing on the Constitution said. That is amazing. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. I will now represent the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and apologies if this question has already been asked, but I like to hear things with my own ears. So, Mr. Yang, what is the census sort of used for? Why do we conduct this onerous process?
The principle used for the census is twofold. One is for the apportionment of Congress, the apportionment of seats in Congress. And the second is to get an accurate count of the population. So when we're distributing funds, whether it's $2.2 trillion in federal funds or state and local funds, that we're distributing in the right way. What that means literally is where roads are built, where schools are built, what services are needed in different communities. For businesses, what that means is what stores get built and what you stock in those shelves of those stores. I live in Fairfax County. The fact that our Costco has approximately seven different types of rice is a reflection of the fact that Fairfax County is about 20% Asian American.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So, I would agree with that, right? Someone who lives in, a city, a county, a state, we're always fighting to get the resources that we need, and it's important to know how many people, regardless of where they come from, regardless of who they are, what they look like, right? What language they speak, what rice they like. It's important to know how many people are in a place so you know how many hospitals to have, how many schools to have, how many parks to have. Am I missing something here?
No, it is as very basic as that. And again, the point is to get an accurate count. One of the things that we've been talking about here is sort of what affects accuracy. And we've talked specifically about Texas and Florida as being inaccurate counts. Well, I would point out that in the case of Florida, the state government only allocated $300,000 to the count for the entire state, compared to the state of Alabama, a much smaller state, which allocated $1.2 million to the count of their residents. So how you do your get out the count operations will translate into how accurate the real results will be. There is a correlation there.
And I do understand that it seems like my Republican colleagues want to get rid of every single foreign-born person, in this country. As it boggles the mind, because
I would object. I think that is attacking. I think that is attacking individuals.
I'd like to have my time.
I think that is attacking individuals.
Mr. Chairman, could you restore the order if you would?
Hold on, does the
I made
gentlelady
an
have
opinion. I can have an opinion.
Is the gentlelady asking to strike?
I am. I'm asking to strike those words, accusing us of that level of racism.
It's not racist if you think it. I mean, it's my opinion. I think I have a right to an opinion.
We'll suspend for 1 second. Well, the gentlelady expressed the specific words you're asking to be
Specifically,
stricken.
what she stated was that the people on the other side wanted all foreign people to be removed from the country. And that's absolutely
As I
untrue.
mentioned, Mr. Chair,
And that
it's
is an
my
attack on every
opinion. I have
person
a right
on
to
this
my
side of the
opinion.
aisle.
I said I
am tired of
Order,
the allegations
order.
of racism.
Mr. Chairman,
Order.
that's
Let me
not.
suspend for a second.
I didn't use race at all.
Let me suspend for 1 moment.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, that's not engaging in personalities. It's not an ad hominem attack.
Yes,
she
it is.
disagrees. She can use her own time to explain why she disagrees.
Everyone suspend for 1 moment. Gentlelady from Wyoming, are you withdrawing the request to strike the words from the?
Yes,
gentlelady
just
from
want to
California?
point out the allegations are absolutely unsubstantiated, and it is ridiculous.
Chairman, could you
I-
instruct her to
yield
point
back.
it out on her own time?
And reclaiming the time, but the gentlelady from California, please proceed. We'll restore the clock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I don't want to use my own time saying, but I guess now perspectives and opinions are no longer important here in this committee. That seems like it would be a shame. Mr. Yang, we were talking about the census, and the question is, it kind of doesn't matter where you come from. If you're someplace, if you're using resources, it would be important for that jurisdiction, for that municipality to know that you are there. I mean, where I come from, if you get sick, you should go to the hospital. And the hospital's not supposed to say, well, who are you? Let me see all of your paperwork. I think the doctors take a Hippocratic oath to help anyone who's coming in bleeding, who would be wanting to need or use the resources that are available to them in that hospital. Do you understand sort of the question that I'm asking about why it's important just to know who is in a particular place?
That's absolutely right. With respect to public services, with respect to roads, that immigration status does not matter when it comes to the need for good roads, the need for good public services. And making sure we have an accurate count of our entire population. And again, if you even go to Supreme Court precedent in Ewenwell, they recognize that you should be doing total population counts, whole population counts for purpose of apportionment. The history on this has been very clear that the census is designed to count the entire population.
Thank you for that. You know, as I look at all of my questions, not one word in any of these questions is the word race. But so Mr. Yang, Assistant Attorney General Rodriguez says in his written testimony that apportionment should not account for those in a state unlawfully. What would be your response to that?
Well, I don't see anything in the Constitution that makes any sort of distinction. Rather, what the 14th Amendment provides in the census, in terms of apportionment, in Article 1, Section 2, with respect to the census, is the counting of whole persons. And it makes no distinction. Now, in the written testimony, it makes reference to the fact that somehow they should be part of a political community, but the notion of political community does not exist anywhere in the text of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, or the Apportionment Act, and certainly even the contemporary dictionaries that he cited, except for a reference to parish law, did not make any reference to being part of a political community. Rather, simply a resident is someone that has a normal place of domicile. Now, to be clear, there are rules that the census has with respect to people that are transient, with respect to people that have tourist visas, for example, should not be counted in the census. There are residency rules with respect to the census as to what is considered a resident.
So you mentioned whole person. In the constitutional framers use the phrase whole number of persons rather than citizen or voter. And why do you think they did that? Because, of course, when you say whole person, and of course, I think, and this time I'm going to use race, but I'm going to talk about myself. There used to be a time when a black person was not even considered a whole person. It was like 3/5 of a person. So I'm getting a little triggered by that phrase. Can you explain sort of why the framers used that phrase?
You're correct, Representative. Unfortunately, when the Constitution was first adopted, slaves were not considered citizens, but and for purpose of the census was considered 3/5 of a person as a distinguished from a so-called whole person. And it wasn't until the 14th Amendment that citizenship was given to slaves, anyone born of slaves, and that sort of in making clear that when we are counting, we're still counting all persons in the state.
So tell me again, can you reiterate for the folks that can't seem to maybe hear what you're saying about why it's important to have an accurate count when you were doing the census?
Well, having an accurate count for purposes of data allows us to make sure that we have the services that we need in the United States for everyone. We need a society that has infrastructure for everyone. It is true for immigrants, non-immigrants alike. Certainly there can be policy debates around different aspects of that, but at least having the set accurate data that all of us can work from is critical to how this nation functions.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from California. I would now recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming.
Well, first of all, I disagree with the idea that that there's a constitutional requirement for conducting a census so that we can have different varieties of rice at Costco. I almost want to say that almost all countries conduct a census.
Mr. Chair, that's racist.
Does the gentlelady have a? Does the gentlelady from Wyoming have a response?
Rice or hamburger or any other food stuff, that isn't why we conduct a consensus.
Mr. Chairman, those words, as ill-advised and foolish as they were probably not engaging in personalities. So I think we can let that go and call it even.
Yes,
after
Mr. Chair, I'll withdraw.
I was using the terminology that Mr. Yang used, if you weren't listening.
I was listening, but I was also getting your vibe.
Almost all.
The gentlelady from Wyoming will proceed.
Almost all countries that conduct a consensus actually have a citizenship question, and the UN says that it is a best practice to include a citizenship question on these censuses. Countries that ask about citizenship are Canada, Australia, Ireland, Germany, and Mexico. The source of this is the New York Times. Mr. Mayfield, I'd like to focus on the Census Bureau's decision to utilize the differential privacy methodology for the first time in the 2020 census. I am incredibly concerned that intentionally creating structural inaccuracy in census data collection at the lowest unit has impacted the reliability of nationwide census counts, congressional reapportionment, assignment of presidential electors, redistricting, and federal funding allocations. In light of these concerns, could you briefly explain the steps that the Census Bureau took when adopting and implementing this differential privacy within the 2020 census?
To put it in shorthand, Congresswoman, this was done at the civil servant level without any legal opinion being obtained. The decision was made by John Aboud, who is the Director of Privacy and Statistics, and a small group of people working with him. There was actually opposition from some other parts of the Bureau because the test repeatedly demonstrated that it would falsify data, including the block level that you mentioned, but anything below the state level. They proceeded with that because they wanted to do differential privacy, not because there was any need for differential privacy. Data swapping, which was the method used in the previous 3 censuses, had always been adequate, and to this day, there is still no problem with it. There is a 2023 study by researchers from Harvard, NYU, and Columbia that finds that data swapping is just as good as differential privacy, but it doesn't alter the data. There was no reason to do this. Now, to give you an example of just how bad it is, again, this is post-use of differential privacy. That study found that the use of differential privacy, for instance, if you had 3 Hispanics on one block, could create a variance anywhere in the state of 0 Hispanics or 6 Hispanics. In other words, a 100% difference either way. All of the data, as Mr. Miller alluded, below the state level has been subjected to differential privacy. Because of the way the algorithm works, it's a top-down algorithm, none of the data can be released in unaltered form. You cannot actually get the results of the survey below the state level. So you may know there are 9 million people in Indiana, but you don't know how many people there are in Muncie. You don't know how many people there are on Mayfield Street in Muncie.
They cooked the books, and they did so intentionally. Is that a good way of describing it?
That is accurate.
All right. So they didn't follow the Administrative Procedures Act. They didn't put this out for notice and comment. They didn't solicit information from people, from statisticians or economists or even states or local governments about how best to do the census of counting their people, as to do as Mr. Yang says, which is to know how many people live in our country. They didn't do any of that?
It's even worse than that, Congresswoman, excuse me. They didn't do notice of comment. There's a debate about whether or not that's required. But there are numerous committees, to allude to something that Congresswoman Scanlon mentioned in her opening statement, in which the census interacts with consumers of census data and partners, including state and local governments, including interest groups. Every single statistical group objected to this by letter. Every single state, the National Conference of Legislatures objected. Maine objected. It's a blue state. Utah objected, a red state. The city of Alexandria, just across the water, very blue, objected. Maricopa County, very red, objected. The House Progressive Caucus, they were right, they objected. The Mexican American Legal Fund, they objected. The Native American tribes objected. Everyone knew, it was well known that this would not work. And the census civil servants, a small group of them, went ahead with it because they wanted to do it, not because there was any need, and disregarding the fact that it made the census inaccurate at the enumeration stage.
They did it because they wanted to cook the books and they wanted to manipulate the data to have the outcome that we actually had, which is overcounting people in 6 blue states or liberal states and giving them additional members in the House of Representatives. Is that fair?
If I might respectfully disagree with that poor part, I believe it was done out of professional pride because there was an obsession with using differential privacy. Several other speakers have alluded to the use of internet data and supercomputers, which is what John Abad mentioned. Congress does not exclude the use of outside data. If anyone here wants to grab census data and buy something from the internet or buy a credit card company's data and combine them, that creates no violation. There is no problem with doing that. Section 9 of Title 13 bars only the disclosure of personal data. In other words, your census form that you filled out for your house. The errors that have been attributed with respect to the number of people are based on post-enumeration surveys. In other words, the census does quality checks after the census, but those are models. They are not themselves enumerations, and they are no good or no better than the models and the data that's put in them. There are errors after every census that are believed. So what you do is you use that data to try to focus your next census and all your other data collections to make sure that you don't miss other people, that you don't overcount them. So it may be an educated guess that some states received more people and some states received fewer, but it is a guess. And it is certainly no better than the modeling that the people in the Bureau did.
Okay, and I know that I am out of time. What I hope comes out of this hearing, however, is that we have solutions of what Congress can do to make sure that these inaccuracies are addressed and that we never have this kind of a mess again. And I also would ask unanimous consent to submit into the record what you need to know about the citizenship question in the census, July 2nd, 2019, by the New York Times.
Without objection, that'll be entered in the record. I thank the gentlelady from Wyoming, and I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, all of our witnesses, because I think there's a lot to dig into here. It's been a really, excuse me, interesting discussion. I guess a couple points of clarification. Mr. Yang, do you think there's general agreement that the purpose of the census clause is to get an accurate count of all persons?
Certainly, that has been the history. It has been nonpartisan, that it is the purpose of the census as defined in the Constitution, defined in the 14th, and then the 14th Amendment for purpose of apportionment is to count all persons. That is the literal text.
And we have considerable constitutional history and court opinions saying they did not choose to say inhabitants. They did not choose to say taxpayers. They did not choose to say citizens or voters. It's persons.
That is correct. And this came up in the context of a Supreme Court case called Evenwell, where an argument was made that apportionment should be based solely on legal voters. The Supreme Court in that case rejected that approach and said that we should be using total population, whole population for purposes of apportionment.
Sure.
And that case was in 2016, so it was only 10 years ago, or 9 years ago.
So, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about what questions should be on the census or not be on the census. And I heard my colleague across the aisle talk about it being a good thing to put a citizenship question on the census. Although I think context is important when we're talking about Canada or Ireland or some of the other states, nation states that were mentioned, they certainly do not have administrations that are actively engaged in hostility towards immigrants. So I think that's an important distinction. But when you were testifying, you talked about the two biggest things that undermined accuracy in the census. And one was privacy concerns and anti-government sentiment. And the second was a lack of robust get out the census, get out the count efforts. I certainly participate in count efforts in my home state. With respect to the privacy and anti-government concerns, I wish Mr. Massey were here because I know it's a big interest of his. But in an era where we've got DOJ kind of trolling through everyone's social security and SNAP records and voting records and everything, can you talk a little bit about how those privacy concerns might be heightened right now?
Well, this goes to, thank you for that question. I think this goes to the decreasing trust that Americans have in U.S. government, which is unfortunate, but that is the case. And that is because of whether we want to talk about DOJ or the Representative Bellant talked about immigration enforcement. Certainly that also breeds distrust within certain pockets of our community, whether it's the Hispanic community, the Asian community. So when we're trying to determine an accurate census, all of that context matters, and simply citing the history of how the census has been used in the past, when there might have been more trust in the government, is different than what we are looking at today.
Yeah, and I certainly hear from my constituents that they're very, very concerned about these efforts to troll all of the federal data, and certainly the census would provide another opportunity to do that. We also have in your testimony on page 5, information about which groups were overcounted or undercounted in the 2020 census. And I would note that non-Hispanic whites were overcounted, but there were some pretty serious undercounts, as you've mentioned before, among Hispanic or Latino, Blacks, children, et cetera. So it does seem important that we try to have more robust counting in those areas.
That's correct. And to be clear, Representative, overall, the census was accurate. When compared to the 2010 and 2000 census, they were all considered statistically insignificant with respect to overcount or undercount. Certainly when you compare it to the 1990, 1980 census, we did much better. That said, we recognize that there are overcounts and undercounts. I think we all agree we should continue to work on figuring that out and how best to do that. Certainly for my community, the Asian community, part of this is outreach. Part of it is also language barriers that people face. Part of it is distrust of the government. So making sure we address all of these barriers. For rural communities, it's internet access, especially in this age now where the census can be conducted by the internet. So we should be thinking about those barriers to make sure how we get an accurate count. And last thing I might add quickly is that also I would ask members of Congress to fully fund the Census Bureau. The budget right now, I think the request is around $2 billion by our community, or $1.8 billion. Right now, I think the funding is at $1.35 billion. If we want to address a lot of these technical issues, as well as figuring out how to do it right to get an accurate count, robust funding is necessary.
Yeah, and the last question I had was with respect to some attempt to conflate the undercounting, which was admitted, of certain Republican-led states, conflating that with some kind of political animus as opposed to it being undercounting relating to these already marginalized populations. Is there anything that you've seen to indicate that it was based on political motivation as opposed to those states just having marginalized populations which have been undercounted across the board?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We have the honor of working with the Census Bureau, and they're dedicated civil servants. They're trying to get this right. They recognize that they did make mistakes, and there were certain undercounts and overcounts. The reason is complex, like we've talked about. Part of it is distrust. Part of it is underinvestment by certain communities in making that count happen. So when you look at it in this aggregate, especially when you look at where the overcounts and undercounts occurred, it's not fair to say that it only occurred in red states or only occurred in blue states. It occurred in a lot of different states, but it also was overall pretty accurate. So we should kind of think about all of these in that context before making any snap judgments.
Well, I appreciate the chairman calling this so we can work on continual improvement of the process. Thank you.
I thank the ranking member, and I will now represent the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you for being easygoing on 5 minutes. That's what I do too. Okay, first of all, Mr. Yang, I just got to interject myself in here on something that you said that was, I thought, offensive. There is a 3/5 clause in our original Constitution that was the result of a compromise. I suppose it could have been 100%, but the reason it wasn't 100% is the freedom-loving people did not want to give the slave states too much power in Congress, okay? You imply that the reason it wasn't 100% was because people were trying to say black people were less than white people. That wasn't the point at all, you understand. The point is that the free states, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, those states did not want to give too much power to the slave states. So it was not done to punish slaves. It was done to looking down the road. Eventually we had a civil war anyway, but it was looking down the road to make sure that the slave states did not have too much power. Okay, you understand that. I hope you understand that, but you just explain the 3/5 thing in a way to make America look worse in the eyes of the young people. So do not appreciate that. Now, question for Mr. Miller. Has the census ever?
Mr. Chairman, could I, just a quick point of order. Would it be possible for me, after the gentleman speaks, to just respond to that, just because of the profundity and the depth of the statement he just made? I think.
It's a gentleman from Wisconsin's time.
And I don't mean to exactly. I don't want to detract from his time. I'm wondering if maybe we could go for a second round just to explicate that.
You and I can talk offline.
Okay.
We'll let the gentleman from Wisconsin
Okay,
continue his
very
questions.
good. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Miller, has the census ever included a citizenship question?
Yes, historically it has included the citizenship question.
Okay. Why was it removed?
That's speculative. I think that there were motives for that. States would be motivated by it if they get more money from the federal government. There's partisan reasons why you would want to do it. There's a lot of reasons, and it's probably fairly complicated.
Who was the president at the time it was removed, you know?
The last one was 50, is what we said, 1950, so.
Truman? Okay, assuming you're right. Has the Supreme Court ever held that it's illegal to include this question?
No, I don't believe the Supreme Court has ever weighed in to say that you cannot ask the citizenship question.
Could President Trump and Commerce Secretary Letnick add a citizenship question to the 2030 census?
Yes.
Okay. Could you give me some benefits? I mean, I'm shocked that it's not on there already, but do you want to speculate on some benefits we'd get if we added such a question?
Well, I mean, it would impact, especially if you got rid of differential privacy. You could know how to allocate federal funding formulas more accurately to make sure that it's going to citizen or lawful permanent resident populations that legally qualify for them. If you want to have this impact redistricting and you want to argue on a constitutional basis that political districts should only represent citizens or citizens and lawful permanent residents, that you would need to know that data, and that would have a massive impact on how political maps are made and who is in Congress.
Couldn't we also assume that people who are not here legally probably aren't going to be hanging around that much longer?
I don't know. I mean, a lot of them have been here for a long time. Some of them are seasonal workers and leave after a couple years. So it's hard for me to answer that precisely with such a large population.
Okay, not across the board, but wouldn't one expect that if some people were here legally or on a temporary visa, that they weren't going to be here for the whole 10 years or maybe even
That's correct. There's a lot of movement of that population both into and out of the United States of America.
Okay. Could you explain the differential privacy controversy, I'll put it?
Yeah, so basically, you have data, and there's been previous methods of keeping that recognizing data privacy laws. And so there was different methods of protecting privacy, and this is a new method, but it's highly flawed because it scrambles all of the data. It literally deconstructs an entire person, reconstructs them in the aggregate all over the place. There's arguments that will disproportionately help urban areas. There's arguments that will disproportionately hurt rural areas. There's racial issues here. But basically, it's fake data below the state level. And it's really hard to create political districts that are accurate and representative of the voting population, especially when you don't have accurate numerical population data at a granular, semi-granular level.
Would you support returning to what we'll call swapping for the 2030 census?
I think there's several other proposals. That is one, combined with the ability to turn off characteristic data until you're at statistically significant levels. There's other methods that are and strategies that are multi-tiered that are mentioned by entities like IPMs that I think would work. So essentially, yes.
Okay, thank you.
With the gentleman,
I think the gentleman from Wisconsin would, regarding.
but I was just wondering if I just wanted the opportunity to respond to Mr. Grothman's intervention.
It's the gentleman's time, but out of courtesy to the ranking member, I'll give the gentleman like 30 seconds.
Okay, I just want to say that the analysis he advanced is historically obtuse and morally disoriented. The slave states took the position that the enslaved African Americans should count 100% for the purposes of reapportionment, but for those purposes only. They didn't have any civil rights, they didn't have any voting rights, they couldn't run for office, they had no civil liberties, they were property. The northern states said they should not count at all.
Reclaiming our time.
They should count zero, and they arrived at the 3/5.
Reclaiming the time. Mr. Chairman. We're going to have a history lesson here. The gentleman from Wisconsin was making a point with respect to the oft-used 3/5 reference.
I was trying to explain what the historical genesis of it is.
And the history of it. The gentleman from Wisconsin characterized it from his perspective, and I think it was important for me to put that on the record, and I think it's been asked and answered, and we don't need to have a history lesson on it, so I'm going to go ahead and proceed with my questions. This hearing, I think, has been illuminating on a number of different levels, and I would like to ask just a sort of a simple question for the panel generally, which is very specifically, was the 2020 census accurate? Mr. Mayfield.
At the state and national level, it was within the margin of error for modern censuses. Below the state level, it was not.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Considering that it counted illegal and non-immigrant aliens, it was inaccurate according to the dictates of the Constitution.
Mr. Miller.
It was the most inaccurate census in modern times, in my opinion.
Mr. Yang.
At the state and national levels, it was accurate. At the sub-levels below that, it was inconsistent at times, but overall still did very well.
And so was it true that in 2022 that the Census Bureau itself acknowledged that there were significant errors and significant discrepancies? Is that correct, Mr. Mayfield?
That is correct.
Right. And did it have significant impact on states, and that there were undercounting and overcounting of at least 14 states? Mr. Mayfield?
That is the census position as of 2022.
Now, was it also accurate that, in fact, the undercounting was often directed towards more conservative states with more Republican representation, and the overcounting was directed towards what we might call blue states with more Democrat representation?
I can't address your use of the word direction. That is certainly what the modeling suggests was the result.
Mr. Miller, would you add to that?
Yeah, the Census Bureau would acknowledge that that would have been the outcome.
And to the tune of as many as 500,000 in the state of Texas, for example?
That's correct, costing Texas an additional congressional seat.
So let's get to the heart then of why. Like, why is that the case? We've posited here in this hearing, I've heard a number of folks represent, that one of the reasons is because of illegal immigrants. So true or false, is the issue of how we count involving illegal immigrants having a direct impact on representation in Congress? Mr. Mayfield.
That is undeniably true.
Mr. Rodriguez.
I agree, and it's been true for at least the last 3 censuses.
Mr. Miller.
It's a mathematical certainty.
Mr. Yang.
Undocumented immigrants are required to be counted under the Constitution.
Do they have a direct impact on how we apportion and how districts are getting set up?
That is less clear to me.
Let me ask you a question, Mr. Yang. You posited earlier some theories about how we count people and that we should count everybody for apportionment purposes. If 75 million people were to come into the state of California between now and 2030, should we have 100 new congressional seats in California if all 75 million of those people were illegally present in the state of California?
That's the way the Constitution is currently constructed, as I understand it.
So that's how, and taking issue with that, by the way, that the Constitution requires that we apportion based on people who are here illegally, which a number of the other people on the panel have questioned, in which at no point has the Supreme Court said that that is the case. Then we're saying here, that I'm just said the Democrat witness is saying that if we had 75 million people illegally flood into the state of California, we must have 100 representatives, again, rounding the math there, added to the state of California. That is extraordinary to me. But I do want to follow up and finish on this question of the differential privacy. The other question that has been raised here, which is highly problematic on a less partisan basis, is the extent to which we have the Census Bureau adopting, by Mr. Mayfield's testimony, by edict of a civil servant bureaucrat at the Census Bureau, a approach to estimating and guessing the population based on something that was attacked by numerous groups, questioned by numerous groups, and is now proven to be statistically problematic, that it is actually causing massive problems with respect to our counting. Is that fair, Mr. Mayfield?
That is accurate.
Mr. Rodriguez, is that fair?
That's fair.
Mr. Miller?
We may disagree on a lot of different things, but I think there's a bipartisan consensus that this is a problem, a big problem.
And Mr. Yang, you said something to the tune of fine-tuning, but you also seem to acknowledge that there are significant problems with respect to the way this is being handled now.
As a new policy, I agree that this is something that needs to be evaluated, absolutely.
And so, Mr. Miller, you've thrown out a couple of ideas. I want to conclude on that point because I think it's really important that there are other ways to go about doing this. And swapping, you get into that. And the issue here for everybody to understand is you have laws that say you got to protect privacy. You've got a massive file that is protected at unbelievable levels of security and inability to look at the data. And so therefore, we've got to figure out how to know that we have an accurate census. And this differential privacy is raising massive concerns on a nonpartisan basis, right? A Harvard study, independent groups on the left, groups on the right. It would seem to me that we should come to a consensus on how we should approach this. Could the gentleman finish, filling in that question and that point?
Absolutely. So at the end of the day, there is a constitutional purpose for all of this. And a privacy statute cannot be a reason by which to ignore the constitutional outgrowths and outflows of what the purpose of this data is. So if we have a privacy standard that is causing, and I think most people would agree with this at this point, that is causing significant data distortion that is impacting all sorts of federal funding formulas, all sorts of potentially, definitely redistricting, potentially depending on how, if it's not everything that we believe it is and not everything that they're purporting to say it is, in theory it's not supposed to affect apportionment. I don't have access to the data, I can't verify that. That's how it's supposed to work. But at the end of the day, we should defer to a privacy method that is also as good and does not create as many constitutional issues as we have seen. If that was not achieved by swapping and turning off data, we need to get our smart people together and figure out another option.
And you were suggesting, closing out my time's over, of turning off the data. That was an approach you're suggesting to try to have an approach. I think, Mr. Yang, can I just ask you on a nonpartisan basis with just a little indulgence? Do you have a perspective on that? Because I saw you kind of nodding and sort of maybe almost in that kind of like intellectual chewing on it as to whether that would be an approach that might help solve the problem of managing privacy, but not having data that's problematic.
Like I said, I think this is worth evaluating, and this is part of what happens after every census, is the Census Bureau looks at what worked, what didn't. It acknowledges that mistakes are made. It acknowledges, in this case, that there were certain overcounts and undercounts. That's no different than any other census. Now the job of the Census Bureau, as with guidance from all of you, is to how to move forward and make that system even better for the next census.
All right, I thank the panel. I now know that my colleague from Texas
I would just
joined us.
seek unanimous consent.
Sure.
I mean, we've discussed the census after review quite a bit, so I'd like to seek unanimous consent to introduce the GAO report on the 2020 census coverage, errors, and challenges to inform the 2030 plans. I think there's been a lot of misstatements about what it shows, so it's good for everybody to have access.
Without objection, we'll insert that into the record, and I'll now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hahn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The time has come to elucidate the American people on the census manipulation that Democrats have been using to influence American elections for years. In 2018, Republican leadership, including the president himself, called for a citizenship question to be included in the 2020 census reports. To no one's surprise, when the Democrats took control, these requests went unanswered, and the question of citizenship was waived. But the fact remains that the concept of sanctuary cities and radical blue states ignoring immigration law and using the illegal population to manipulate the lines of congressional districts is in fact unconstitutional. Not only are there severe constitutional concerns from the inclusion of illegal immigrants, but the Census Bureau admitted to having made several, quote, errors in their 2020 census report. Convenient, seeing that as in 2020, Donald Trump was on top of the ticket. In 2020, the Bureau undercounted in primarily deep red states such as Arkansas, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas, all red, while overcounting in radical left blue states like Delaware, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, and Rhode Island. This egregious error led to many states being denied proper representation in Congress and the Electoral College. So much so that these errors cost Republicans not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, but 6 seats in the House. In addition to the 2020 miscounting, including illegal immigrants in the census has improperly granted radical left blue states 12 additional seats in the United States House of Representatives. It's a total of 18 seats gained. That is a huge problem, and those are the facts. Mr. Mayfield, thank you so much for being here, sir. I have a question for you, if you don't mind. You, sir, are a seasoned litigator who has practiced in matters ranging from complex commercial litigation to constitutional and administrative law. In your expert opinion, and I want you to really speak about this in long form because I want this recorded, should illegal aliens be included in the apportionment process under the 14th Amendment?
The Supreme Court has never directly addressed that, Congressman.
Mm-hmm.
For apportionment purposes, as Congress has interpreted it, the Supreme Court has held that it currently applies to all people, regardless of citizenship. There is certainly an open question as to whether or not, if Congress were to direct the Census Bureau to do it differently, as to whether or not that would be legal.
Okay, so in regards to thinking more of a high level, in terms of being a citizen and what it means to be a citizen in this country, and I do believe that being a citizen in this country means that you have the right to choose the leadership if you're a tax-paying legal citizen in this country. If you are an illegal person in this country, should you, under any circumstances, be allowed to vote and choose leadership in this country?
That wouldn't be an expert opinion. As a citizen, I would object to that.
And what about you, Ms. Rodriguez?
I also object to that.
Mr. Miller?
Correct. Citizens should not be, illegal aliens should not be voting.
And that applies to you also, Mr. Yang. I'd love to hear your response to this question.
Non-citizens are not allowed to participate in federal elections.
Okay. Are they participating in federal elections?
The studies have shown that there are very few instances in which they have.
So that number needs to be 0. And as somebody who is a proud Texan, we and in Florida have done our best to get that number to 0. And in spite of the fact that I just voted a couple of weeks ago, and we voted with paper ballots that we had to show an ID for, that they didn't verify my address and where I lived. And then I had to put said piece of paper through a machine, copied it, they gave me another copy, then they gave me my very proud I voted sticker. And even with those stringent rules, with my daughter who is 7 years old was actually with me, she too got an I voted sticker. And guess what? With those stringent laws, we still have illegals voting in federal elections. So the question is not even about what's happening in Texas. If it's happening in Texas, you have to imagine that while it may seem like a minuscule amount to you, sir, that number needs to be 0. And if it's happening in Texas with those stringent rules, imagine what's happening in other blue states that don't have anything that closely resembles that level of redundancy to ensure that the person that voted in that election is in fact a citizen that has an address and has an ID. And with that, I'll yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman from Texas. That concludes today's hearing. We thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.